Welcome to Recap Realm, the place where stories come back to life. I'm your narrator, guiding you through the most intense, twisted, and jaw-dropping manhwa tales. Whether it's revenge, power, money, or second chances, we break it all down, one episode at a time. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story.
The moment he saw his friend hurled across the arena and brutally smashed into the wall, something inside him snapped. Rage surged through him like a tidal wave. He couldn't understand why this was happening, why they were being treated like this. But there was no time to think. Blinded by fury, the next thing he knew, he was tearing through monsters with his bare hands. The goblin leader, who had moments ago stood tall and arrogant, suddenly froze in fear. Our boy grabbed him and ripped his arm clean off. No hesitation, no mercy. Then, without a word, he took the goblin's own weapon and ended him in a single strike. The elves watching from above, once so smug and entertained, now stared in horror, because deep down, they knew they were next. But how did he even end up in this nightmare? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. The story begins in a dense forest where two individuals are fleeing from a horde of goblins. The goblins, armed and relentless, are closing the distance fast. One particularly muscular goblin raises its weapon, aiming to strike down a red-haired girl. As she prepares to block the attack with her own weapon, she instantly realizes she's too late. The blow is coming too fast. But just before it lands, the protagonist appears, landing a powerful punch straight into the goblin's stomach, saving the girl in the nick of time. It's revealed that the girl's name is Aspen. The protagonist informs her that the fortress is still far ahead. Gripping his sword tightly, he makes the decision to hold off the goblins so Aspen can make it there safely. Aspen insists they're almost there, and rushes toward the fortress to open its massive doors, while the protagonist remains behind to fend off the advancing horde. With a single devastating swing of his massive sword, he slices the goblins in half, buying her precious time. Meanwhile, Aspen reaches the fortress and pushes the huge wooden doors open. After doing so, she calls out for the protagonist to hurry. He takes down one final goblin in brutal fashion before sprinting toward the fortress. But just then, a goblin unlike the rest steps forward, larger, stronger, and wielding a massive curved spear made of twisted wood. This goblin, clearly on another level, launches the spear directly at the protagonist. He turns too late. Blood splashes across his armor. In a shocking turn, Aspen had stepped in at the last moment, pushing him out of harm's way. In doing so, the massive spear tears through part of her body. The pain is overwhelming, but she clenches her teeth and endures it. The goblins pause, marveling at their apparent victory. The protagonist, however, picks Aspen up and tells her to hold on. Without wasting a second, he dashes toward the fortress. Behind him, the same muscular goblin from earlier, likely the leader, roars a command to the others, ordering them to pursue and not let the pair escape. Unbeknownst to them, a group of suspicious-looking elves has been observing the entire scene from a monitor. Among them, a short, rotund elf appears particularly disturbed. He can't believe the protagonist is going head-to-head with both goblins and orcs at the same time. With a sinister smirk, he declares that they've found their next target. Back at the battlefield, one goblin manages to slip through and attempts to hold the door open, but it's instantly stopped by a crushing blow to the face, killing it on the spot. As the lifeless body drops, the goblin leader watches in silence. Outside, the protagonist steps forward to confront the goblins. Frustrated and bewildered by the fact that these monsters have been chasing them non-stop for an entire week, he radiates a powerful aura, casually carrying an entire cannon barrel over his shoulder. With a mix of irritation and sarcasm, he questions whether these monsters ever take a day off, then admits that it doesn't really matter, since he doesn't either. Before the goblins can respond, three of them leap toward him. Without flinching, he hurls the cannon barrel directly at them, killing all three in one brutal instant. The sheer savagery of using something as massive as a cannon barrel as a weapon shocks even the other goblins, leaving them frozen in disbelief. Seizing the opportunity, the protagonist quickly retreats and slams the fortress doors shut behind him. Inside, Aspen, still wounded, calls him a crazy bastard for using an entire cannon barrel as a weapon. He calmly advises her not to speak, reminding her that talking will only worsen her already severe injury. Aspen, clearly in pain but still thinking tactically, mentions that she has an idea of what to do next. But the protagonist interrupts, already knowing where she's going with it, and tells her to stay quiet for now. She suggests that those who can still move should retreat first, but once again he cuts her off, telling her to stop talking. As he continues to hold the door, she insists that it's an order, claiming he should follow it, and adds that if he didn't like it, he should have joined her earlier. Before he can respond, a heavy wooden weapon suddenly cracks through the door, forcing silence into the room. The goblin leader slowly peeks through the splintered opening, wearing a chilling grin as he declares that he has found his target. The protagonist, unfazed, draws his sword. With an almost majestic presence, he tells Aspen that he's not retreating. His eyes begin to glow with a fierce light as he declares that he might actually create a legend by wiping out the entire goblin horde. The moment carries the raw energy of something straight out of Goblin Slayer. Hearing this, Aspen softly calls him by name, and it's revealed that the protagonist is named Needon. As she looks upward into the sky, she wonders aloud about the mysterious object hovering above. Needon turns, and what meets his eyes is nothing short of astonishing. A massive, saucer-like flying object hovering in the sky, resembling something out of an alien invasion. Even the goblin leader and the rest of his horde were stunned as they stared up at the sky. A moment later, a beam of light shot down from the hovering ship, and it began pulling everything upward. The first to be caught were the goblins, who screamed as they were lifted helplessly into the air. Panic gripped the goblin leader as he looked toward the protagonist, demanding to know if this was some kind of magic he had cast. But even Needon and Aspen were caught in the pull of the beam. Needon fought against the force, desperately trying to hold on to Aspen's unconscious body. Her earlier wound had clearly taken a toll. She was no longer responsive. He called her name, urging her to wake up, even attempting to drive his sword into the ground to anchor them in place. But the beam's power was overwhelming. Despite his efforts, Aspen slipped from his grip and was pulled upward. Needon shouted her name as the ship consumed everything in its path, including himself. Then, everything went black. When Needon next opened his eyes, he found himself tied up and lying on the ground. 2 elf soldiers stood over him. Looking up at them, Needon could hardly believe his eyes. Trying to rise, he took in his surroundings and immediately sensed that this was nothing like the elf forests he had heard about. Before he could act, the elf soldiers dragged him back down, one of them stepping on his back while the other fastened a choking device around his neck, something resembling a slave collar. He demanded to know what they were doing, but his protest was met with a blast of energy from a glowing crystal embedded in the crest. The surge of power weakened him, nearly knocking him out. One of the elves casually remarked that they had caught some fresh fish today, clearly referring to Needon. The other elf coldly warned Needon to pull himself together if he wanted to survive another day. As they spoke, the entire platform beneath Needon began to shift and rise, and he couldn't help but wonder what was happening. From the way things were moving, it felt like he was being lifted into something, some kind of dome. He was right. Moments later, Needon found himself standing in the center of a massive arena. The air erupted with noise as an announcer declared the arrival of a new rookie warrior and sacrificial offering. The stands were packed with elves, all of them focused on him. Some of them remarked that he was a sapien, claiming they'd never seen one before. Others mocked his appearance, pointing out how weak he looked. Needon scanned the crowd and quickly noticed that every spectator had pointed ears, undeniably elves. As he turned to take in more of his surroundings, he spotted the goblins from earlier. They were also chained and positioned inside the arena. One of them shouted at the elves, demanding to know why they had been captured. Needon's attention shifted to the brands on the goblins' necks, glowing marks that he didn't recognize. They were not ordinary wounds or scars, but something far more sinister, something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. The announcer continued, laying out the brutal rules of the arena in a chillingly casual tone. He explained that there were exactly 100 participants standing within the arena, but only 3 would be allowed to survive. These cutoff points, as he called them, were based on an evaluation system where investors would determine the worth of each participant. In this twisted scenario, the value of life itself had been reduced to a form of speculative entertainment. Who among them, whether goblin or sapien, would prove themselves worthy enough to survive? The goblins, clearly unfamiliar with such systems, were left in confusion. They turned toward their leader for answers, but the grim expression on his face said it all. He had already figured out what the announcer truly meant. Without saying a word, he gripped his weapon, ready for what was about to unfold. Suddenly, a human boy broke into a run across the arena floor, panicking and yelling that he wanted no part in this madness. He cried out that the elves had promised to release him after his last participation. But it wasn't just him. A large group made up of various races, including dwarves, lizardmen, and other humans, were all begging and weeping, pleading with the elves to stop whatever was about to happen. Up in the stands, the short, fat elf from earlier gave a simple command. In the next instant, a blinding beam of light descended from above, vaporizing the entire group in a single blast. Nothing remained of them. The boy who had been running was the only one spared, collapsing onto the blood-stained ground in complete shock. The announcer mocked them, asking why they were acting surprised. They should have already known that once inside the arena, there was no escape except through combat. He added coldly that anyone lacking the will to fight was free to speak up so that the heavenly punishment launcher could deal with them accordingly. Terrified, the lone boy began crawling toward Needon, tears running down his face as he begged for help. Seeing another human gave him hope. He pleaded with Needon to help him escape, to get him home. But before Needon could even respond, an axe came crashing down from behind, silencing the boy for good. Lifting his gaze, Needon saw that a goblin had struck the boy. The goblin then turned to rally its fellow monsters, shouting that they all heard the announcer loud and clear. It was time to do what they were born to do, fight. Motivated by the speech, the goblins roared and charged toward Needon. Some even turned on the other participants, slaughtering them where they stood. The arena became a scene of pure chaos as screams echoed and bodies fell. Most of the victims were humans, mercilessly cut down with no chance to defend themselves. Still holding the boy's lifeless body, Needon stared at the tear-streaked face frozen in death. Though his own face was hidden behind his helmet, something inside him shifted. His hands trembled slightly, then clenched with rage. His eyes began to burn with fury as he gently laid the boy down. Two goblins watching from a distance sneered, calling him soft. One of them recognized him, asking if this wasn't the same guy they had been chasing in the forest. The other goblin confirmed it. Needon rose slowly. His eyes were glowing now, brimming with power. The goblins wanted to fight? Then so be it. If they were going to do what they were good at. Needon decided it was time he did the same. And as he stood tall in the middle of the carnage, his entire body began to radiate with power. Although Needon's hands were still chained together, he stood tall and confident as three goblins lunged at him. Using the momentum from the first goblin's swing, Needon shattered the chain binding his wrists, and with one powerful stomp to the ground, he wound up a devastating punch. It landed squarely on the goblin's chin, the sheer force of the blow launching the massive creature straight into the air. Without wasting a second, Needon turned to the other two. He grabbed his sword, drove it through the throat of the second goblin, killing it instantly, and stood firmly, unshaken. The last goblin behind him thought it still had a chance. It grabbed Needon's head from behind, trying to lift and smash it into the ground. But Needon, with raw, brutal strength, crushed the goblin's wrist in his bare hand. Then, with a swift and acrobatic maneuver, he slammed the goblin into the arena floor with such force that it died instantly. In that moment, Needon didn't look like a human anymore. He looked like a monster in human form. More goblins rushed him, but it didn't matter. Needon moved like a machine, cutting them down one after the other. His methods were ruthless. He punched goblins to death, crushed skulls underfoot, and showed not a shred of mercy. Even the elves watching from above were stunned into silence. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then, standing in the middle of the blood-soaked arena with a cold, defiant glare, Needon raised his middle finger toward the crowd, declaring that they should never underestimate a Lionwing Knight of the Human Union. The gesture drew a mix of reactions. Some elves stared in shock, others were mesmerized, and a few seemed genuinely impressed. Meanwhile, back among the goblins, their second-in-command, the same one who had killed the human boy earlier, asked the goblin leader if he should intervene, since Needon was effortlessly wiping out their ranks. But the leader refused. He calmly ordered him to wait, explaining that they should simply increase the number of goblins for now, and observe what happens. More goblins were sent into the fray, but Needon remained unfazed. With savage efficiency, he began using the goblins' own weapons against them. He tore through their ranks, swinging his sword and slicing three goblins in half with a single motion. At this point, Needon wasn't fighting like a soldier. He was like a beast on the battlefield. Two goblins, clearly more skilled than the rest, circled him, each armed with a spear. But when they attacked, Needon parried one strike and redirected it into the other goblin, causing one to fatally wound his own ally. Then, with a clean sweep of his sword, Needon severed the remaining goblin's head. Seeing this, the goblin vice-captain finally stepped forward. The leader followed, entering the arena as well. But Needon didn't flinch. In fact, his fury only grew. He pointed his sword directly at the goblin leader, and growled that his face looked familiar. The goblin leader responded with a twisted smile, and that's when Needon recognized him. This was the same goblin who had thrown the spear that wounded Aspen. And just like that, Needon's rage reached a whole new level. The leader of the goblins couldn't help but acknowledge Needon's skill, casually praising him for being quite adept in the art of combat. But Needon, still pointing his sword forward, wasn't interested in small talk. With a cold glare in his eyes, he demanded to know why the goblins were talking so much. He ordered them to stop wasting time with nonsense, and to come at him with everything they had. The goblin leader grinned and gave his second-in-command the signal to attack. The second-in-command, marked by his distinctive black hair, charged at Needon without hesitation, and Needon did the same. But to the surprise of everyone watching, Needon was actually pushed back. The elves observing from the upper stands began to murmur among themselves. They were confused. This was the same human who had taken down dozens of goblins with ease just moments ago, yet now he was struggling against a single opponent. Some began speculating if something was wrong with him. Others claimed this was the obvious outcome all along and started canceling their bets. But in the midst of the doubtful chatter, a single pink-haired female elf sat quietly, her eyes glimmering with admiration as she watched Needon. Glancing at her tablet, the betting odds were brutal. 0.1% in Needon's favor versus 99.99% against. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, she confidently placed a bet on him. Back in the arena, Needon was clearly struggling to keep up with the black-haired goblin. The goblin, wearing a smug grin, pressed on with aggressive strikes, overwhelming Needon at every turn. Just as it looked like the final blow was coming, Needon suddenly dodged the attack and countered with a sharp, fluid spin, his sword slicing clean across the goblin's neck. The technique was sharp and precise, and two elven warriors watching from above couldn't help but comment on it. One of them admitted that Needon wasn't bad at all. The shorter of the two, a female elf, began lecturing, noting that sapiens usually had the worst survival rates in the arena, so for someone like Needon to have made it this far was no small feat. She turned to the larger, muscular elf beside her, her younger brother, and asked him with a twisted excitement in her voice whether their opponent would be Needon or one of the goblins later on. Bloodlust flickered in her eyes, but the muscular elf remained calm, answering that it didn't matter because the result would always be the same. Back in the arena, Needon's eyes began to glow with raw power as he acknowledged that the second-in-command goblin had actually been a bit more challenging than the others. With the black-haired goblin now lying lifeless at his feet, the rest of the goblins stood frozen in shock. Without hesitation, Needon tossed the body to the ground and calmly began approaching the remaining goblins. He mocked them, saying they were still only at the level of the Knock Guild, meaning to him they were nothing. As he closed the distance, the goblin leader stepped forward and admitted that even during the chase earlier, he had sensed something unusual about Needon. There was no doubt in his mind, this human was extraordinary. Reaching out a hand, the goblin leader made an unexpected proposal. He asked Needon to join them, claiming that if they worked together, they could rise to power. He gestured toward the arena, toward the uncivilized and barbaric elves watching them from above, and offered Needon a place beside him. With his own authority as Legion commander and Needon's unmatched strength, they could wipe out all the elves in the arena in an instant, but Needon was having none of it. His fury swelled at the goblin's words. He looked the goblin dead in the eyes and demanded to know what was wrong with them, why their minds always turned toward conquest and domination. He made it clear he didn't care about the elves, the dwarves, or any of their twisted games. All he cared about was finding Aspen. As soon as he found her, they were leaving. The goblin leader scoffed, calling him a waste of talent. Tension sparked like wildfire, and with nothing more to say, the two finally clashed. Just as Needon and the goblin leader were about to fully engage in battle, a loud mechanical rumble echoed across the arena. One of the massive gates began to creak open, drawing the attention of everyone present. It appeared that a new challenger, or rather a new monster, was being released into the arena. Two of the remaining goblins nearby looked on in confusion, unsure whether they should keep fighting or prepare for whatever horror was coming next. The announcer's voice boomed with theatrical excitement, declaring that the long-awaited moment had finally arrived. The arena's notorious mascot, Yebuyuni, was now entering the field. Yebuyuni was a grotesque abomination, its massive crocodile-like body twisted together with 8 monstrous spider legs. Its sheer size was overwhelming, and its presence radiated primal terror. As it let out a bone-chilling roar, even the goblin leader and Needon were forced to momentarily shift their focus. Needon, still trying to grasp what was happening, barely had time to react before Yebuyuni lunged forward and instantly devoured the 2 stunned goblins. Without even pausing, the beast turned its menacing gaze toward Needon and the goblin leader, its hunger clearly unsatisfied. Realizing the threat, Needon lowered his sword from the goblin leader and redirected it toward the incoming monster. He muttered that he was already sick of these annoying goblins, but now a much greater threat had arrived. However, before he could act, a sudden grip seized him from behind. The second-in-command goblin, who had earlier appeared dead, had merely been faking its demise. Bloodied and severely injured, it used its remaining strength to restrain Needon, locking him in place. With Needon held down, the goblin cried out for its leader to strike. The goblin leader didn't hesitate. In one swift, ruthless motion, he drove his sword straight through Needon's body, piercing clean through and impaling his own subordinate in the process. Both figures collapsed to the ground, weakened and vulnerable. Yebuyuni, sensing the wounded prey, began to charge toward them. The goblin leader quickly moved out of the way, leaving Needon to face the beast alone. As the monster closed in, Needon, bleeding and pinned to the ground, began to wonder if this was truly the end. Was this how his story would end, in a pit filled with monsters and betrayal? But just before despair could fully take him, a familiar presence stepped forward. Aspen had returned. Her sudden entrance caused an uproar among the elves, astonished that another sapien had survived. Standing tall and composed, she calmly tied her hair back, her gaze locked on the monster ahead. Turning to Needon, she praised him for how far he had come, and told him to rest now. Drawing her sword with a quiet smile, she declared that she would take care of the rest. With fire in her eyes, she proclaimed that it was time for the 2 wings to protect the outer wings, a clear reference to Needon and their shared mission, and not gonna lie, she looked seriously cool doing it. As the monster charged with terrifying speed and vicious intent, ready to swallow him whole, Needon managed to call out to Aspen. His voice was weak but filled with concern. He questioned whether she truly intended to face such a monstrous beast in her current condition. Her wound from earlier was still fresh, barely healed. But Aspen, calm as ever, admitted that she wasn't even sure if defeating the monster would save them both. Still, she closed her eyes and told Needon that if he somehow survived this, he should do one thing: remember her. With that, she activated her sword technique. Standing with quiet resolve, she waited for the right moment, and just as the monster lunged close, Aspen launched forward with precision. In a blinding flurry of motion, she delivered a series of rapid slashes across the monster's thick body. The technique, known as the piercing style, full moon slash, was executed flawlessly. From the stands, the elves erupted in surprise and excitement. Despite her small build, Aspen's speed and power left them in awe. Some who had doubted her began to place new bets in her favor, impressed by the sheer elegance and force of her technique. But Aspen felt it, something was off. Even though her strikes landed perfectly, the sensation of cutting through the creature was unusually shallow. The monster's crocodilian hide had absorbed much of the impact, and in the next moment, it became clear the beast was unfazed. Her expression shifted as panic began to creep into her face. The attack had failed to deal any significant damage. Needon, still collapsed and writhing in pain, saw the shift in Aspen's posture and instantly knew what it meant. Things had gone south, fast. Gritting his teeth, he reached for the sword still embedded in his torso. With sheer force and determination, he yanked it out, blood pouring freely from the wound. The pain was indescribable, but he had no choice. He dropped to his knees, breathing heavily. Images of Aspen getting injured while shielding him before flashed through his mind. That moment, that failure to protect her, came back with crushing weight, and with a surge of raw determination, Needon rose again. One thing was clear, he wasn't going to let that happen a second time. Back on the battlefield, the monster lunged at Aspen once again, but for some reason she froze, paralyzed by fear. Needon, seeing what was about to happen, screamed out for her, his voice raw with desperation, urging her to move. Aspen, regaining a shred of composure, turned just in time to see Needon sprinting toward her, still shouting for her to get out of the way. That's when she saw it, the incoming strike, and realized it was already too late to dodge. With no other choice, Aspen charged forward, determined to meet the attack head-on. If it was going to end here, she would go out swinging. Twisting her body mid-strike to maximize her damage output, she managed to land a powerful slash across the monster's body, and for the first time she drew its blood. The beast collapsed momentarily, stunned, and Aspen, clutching her still unhealed wound, realized she had overexerted herself. Still, with a faint smile, she turned toward Needon and asked if he thought she was amazing. But to her horror, Needon was still screaming at her, yelling for her to move. Before she could react, the monster's tail lashed out violently, striking her with terrifying force. The blow sent her flying across the arena, crashing brutally into the wall. Her body crumpled against it, drenched in blood, motionless. She looked like a lifeless doll tossed aside. In the stands, the elves erupted, not in concern, but in curses. They shouted at Aspen and Needon, blaming them for their lost bets. Some sneered, wishing death upon them both. Others began cheering for Yebelni, calling for the monster to kill everyone. But those words, that moment, broke something inside Needon. He finally snapped. His vision blurred red with rage. Everything around him ceased to matter. All he could think about was destroying everything and everyone who kept hurting Aspen. Like a force of pure vengeance, Needon tore through the remaining monsters in the arena with his bare hands. He didn't register what he was doing anymore. All that mattered was death. The goblin leader tried to plead, screaming that the match was already over, but Needon didn't hear him. In one brutal motion, he tore off the goblin's arm, and gripping the leader's own axe, hacked him to pieces. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just pure mindless fury. Even the elves watching from above were shaken. Some were stunned into silence, others blown away by the sheer brutality. The pink-haired elf who had bet on Needon couldn't help but smile, entranced by his terrifying power. The others were mesmerized or horrified as Needon continued to pound the goblin leader's body until there was nothing left to recognize. The elf guards finally rushed into the arena, collars in hand. Using their suppression chokers, they managed to pin Needon to the ground. He didn't resist. On the inside, all he could do was whisper a quiet apology to Aspen, realizing he had failed to keep his promise. They knocked him out with the same crystal restraints used earlier. The scene then shifted to the short, fat elf seen previously, clearly the leader of the arena. Watching from his elevated platform, he ordered the guards to open the cell gate. Inside, Needon sat chained, his body broken but his eyes burning with quiet defiance. Despite the fact that Needon had entered the arena with a betting rate of only 0.91% and still came out on top, the fat elf wasn't pleased. He had lost a fortune, and the look of hatred in his eyes said it all. But Needon just stared back, cold and unmoved. The leader of the arena then proceeded to splash a bucket of cold water on Needon's body. But instead of getting angry, Needon simply mentioned that he was feeling thirsty, so having water splashed on him wasn't all that bad. Enraged by his nonchalant response, the fat elf struck him with the empty bucket, demanding if Needon understood what he had done. Needon, confused, asked what the elf was even talking about. He pointed out that they were the ones who brought him to this place out of nowhere, and now they were asking questions like he was the problem. The fat elf, growing more furious, grabbed a choker from one of the guards, and used it to electrocute Needon. Still fuming, the elf asked if Needon knew what the most entertaining thing in the arena was. He claimed there was nothing more thrilling than a fight soaked in blood. Watching people battle to the brink of death, and picking the victor was a source of endless excitement for the elves. But for him it was more than just a game, it was business. He added that the once dull heavenly arena had become a groundbreaking enterprise. They lured in humans from across the lands, forced them into brutal battles, and sold the survivors into slavery. That was the plan. Simple and profitable. But Needon had ruined everything. The elf explained that the main event for the day had been centered around the goblins, creatures with formidable physical prowess and the fierce warrior spirit of their tribal heritage. They were captured to fight for the crowd's amusement, and the survivors were meant to be sold off. Everything had been going according to plan until Needon interfered. The leader shocked him again with the choker, shouting that Needon had derailed the entire operation, even severely injuring the arena's prized mascot. As the elf ranted in frustration, Needon again questioned what nonsense this fool was spouting. Releasing his aura, Needon declared that all the arena's losses were the fat elf's own fault. The moment he sensed Needon's growing power, the arena leader cowered in fear, retreating behind his guards. But Needon pressed on, demanding if he was the one who volunteered to be thrown into the arena, reminding them that it was the elves who dragged him into this mess in the first place. Surprisingly, the elf agreed, admitting that he did bear some responsibility for bringing Needon here. In fact, as far as he was concerned, Needon now belonged to him. With a smug calmness, the fat elf stated that Needon would be made to fight again and again, until every coin of the money lost that day was repaid. But Needon wasn't about to accept that. He shouted back, asking if the elf was stupid, letting his aura surge with intensity as he declared that he didn't care about the elves or their twisted games in the arena. Unbothered, the elf coldly remarked that it was a shame Needon's friend, the girl, had died. Those words lit a fire in Needon's eyes. His fury began to rise, but before he could respond, the fat elf turned and left, casually saying that Needon should take some time to think about his offer. Left alone in the dim silence of his cell, Needon began to reflect on his situation. The reality sank in like cold steel. Escaping from this nightmare wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. To him, this place felt less like a prison and more like being thrown into a furnace, merciless and absolute. With grief weighing down his gaze, he blamed himself for Aspen's death. The guilt dug deep, gnawing at his conscience, until a voice, soft but unsettling, cut through the silence. It questioned the certainty of Aspen's demise, challenging whether Needon had truly witnessed the moment of death. The voice belonged to a young, eerie-looking elf girl who stepped out from a swirling black portal. Despite her childlike appearance, her presence was anything but innocent. When Needon demanded answers, she introduced herself with a smirk, calling herself his supporter, though the title seemed intentionally vague. He ignored the label, far more concerned with her earlier implication. She had hinted that Aspen might still be alive, and now he wanted the truth. The elf teased him for being so focused on that single detail, especially when there were so many other disturbing things to worry about. But Needon didn't waver. He pushed her again, and she finally confirmed what he hoped to hear. Aspen was alive. Relief turned into urgency. He demanded to know where, but the elf dismissed the question as irrelevant, refusing to elaborate. The tone in Needon's voice changed instantly. Anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, and the elf noticed. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a threat. But rather than retreat, she leaned in with amusement, conjuring an image with her magic to show him what truly mattered next. His upcoming opponent in the arena wasn't just another beast. This time, it was a chimera, a grotesque fusion of monstrous parts, stronger and more terrifying than anything before. She explained that this creature made Aspen's previous opponent look like a warm-up act. Despite the monstrous sight, Needon showed little reaction. There was no panic, no fear, only rage. Deep down, he had already decided this thing had hurt Aspen, and for that, it would pay. The elf questioned his lack of fear, but Needon made it clear that fear wouldn't change anything. He had no space left for hesitation. Changing gears, he asked about her intentions, trying to understand why someone like her would offer support in a place like this. She answered with a sweet, unsettling smile, claiming that she simply wished for his victory. But Needon wasn't naive. He knew the world didn't hand out favors without price. Sensing his suspicion, her smile faded into something colder. A pulse of magic flared around her, just enough to remind him who held the power. She stepped closer, her expression now serious, and clarified their dynamic. She wasn't making a request, she was issuing a command. If she wanted him to win, then he would win. No questions, no resistance, and if he didn't, then she would make sure Aspen didn't live to see another day. That statement shifted the air. Neidon's bloodlust began to leak out, sharp and dangerous, but the elf remained unfazed. She welcomed it. Amused by his reaction, she prepared to leave, reminding him one last time that both his fate and Aspen's rested entirely in her hands. Before vanishing, she left a final warning. Every loss in the arena would cost him far more than just the match. As the portal closed and silence returned, Neidon could only grit his teeth in frustration. Whatever this creature was, she wasn't here to help. In his mind, one bitter truth echoed clearly. She was nothing but a manipulative, sadistic bitch. The next day, Neidon found himself being escorted down the corridors by two female elf guards. Heavy chains clinked with every step, binding his hands as if that would make any difference now. Inwardly, he couldn't help but wonder if the elves could at least let a man stretch his legs before sending him off to die. A small courtesy, perhaps, but clearly too much to ask in a place like this. When they arrived at the arena's command chamber, Needon immediately dropped to his knees in front of the master of the arena, a calculated gesture of submission. The elf lord, short, round, and brimming with smug authority, wasted no time in addressing him. He asked if a long night in chains had changed the human's mind, if Needon was finally ready to beg for his life. With his head bowed even lower, Needon began speaking, offering a formal apology for all the chaos and damage he had caused, both physically and financially. The master of the arena, clearly pleased, commended the human for finally coming to his senses. But then, in typical elven fashion, he reminded Needon that words alone would not change his fate. Of course, that's when Needon's real thoughts slipped through the cracks of his polite mask. He mentally cursed the fat little tyrant for interrupting him, but outwardly he continued his performance. He explained that he was fully aware of what awaited him in the arena, a death sentence disguised as a spectacle, but to him it didn't matter. Death had always been a shadow trailing behind. He spoke not with despair, but with grim acceptance. Knights like him never lived comfortable lives. They chased danger on the battlefield, again and again, until it finally caught up to them. Their fates were always sealed the moment they took up the sword. But the master of the arena didn't seem interested in poetic truths. He questioned what any of that had to do with the current situation. Needon answered with a proposition. If the master wanted a proper show, then he would give him one. He vowed to fight with everything he had and deliver a spectacle worthy of the arena's reputation. And in return, all he asked for was one thing: to be sent back to the human world when it was all over. That made the arena lord pause. For a brief moment, even he seemed caught off guard by the clarity of the request. Then, surprisingly, he agreed. Perhaps it was time to think positively for once. He accepted Needon's proposal. A wave of quiet relief passed through Needon. Outwardly, he remained composed, but internally, he knew better than to celebrate. These elves were never going to let him go that easily. But that wasn't what mattered most right now. Aspen was still alive, and that changed everything. His new purpose was clear: escape, no matter the cost, even if he had to do it alone. The idea of breaking out with Aspen in tow seemed near impossible, but if there was even a sliver of a chance, he would take it, and if he managed to get out, he wouldn't come back empty-handed. The humans had their own countermeasures prepared, especially for airborne threats like dragon flights. If he made it back, he'd return with firepower, the kind of firepower that could burn this entire place down. With an agreement now in place between Needon and the master of the arena, the two elf guards wasted no time escorting him to his next battlefield. But this time, the setting was different. Not the usual blood-soaked arena floor, but a quiet forested zone that felt far more ominous in its silence. Without warning, one of the guards stepped in and injected something into his neck. Before Needon could react, his entire body convulsed in pain, muscles locking up as he crumpled to the ground. He tried to ask what they had done, what kind of poison now coursed through his veins, but the elf didn't respond. She simply undid his restraints and walked away, leaving him sprawled there, weakened and burning from the inside. Later, he lay in the grass, recovering slowly, his thoughts bitter and unsurprised. Of course they'd try something underhanded. This kind of treachery was expected by now. He reminded himself that by this point, he had become more accustomed to fighting in less than ideal conditions. Pain, exhaustion, poison, it was just background noise. In front of him, a glowing system window appeared, breaking through the haze of his thoughts. He stared at it with tired annoyance. Another trick from the elves, no doubt. This time it was a voting panel, an arena feature, allowing spectators to bet on who they thought would survive until the end. A game within a game, where lives were currency and death was just entertainment. Needon couldn't help but wonder if this upcoming battle would follow the same pattern as before: chaos, survivors scrambling in fear, and an inevitable massacre. Whatever the case, he knew it was time to stop playing defensively. This time, he would use his trump card. Peeling off the armored glove from his right hand, he revealed a glowing magical circle engraved into his skin. As the sigil activated, a surge of raw power coursed through him, igniting every nerve. The poison began to react instantly, dragged toward his throat by the force of the spell. In the next moment, he vomited it out violently, purging it from his body. The toxicity of the substance became clear when a nearby frog dropped dead on the spot, suffocated by the fumes. Needon, however, felt revitalized. His strength was returning. The haze was lifting. His body, though bruised, was once again his to command. Just as he prepared himself to begin the match, something caught his attention overhead. Turning his gaze skyward, he spotted a group of 4 dragons flying in formation, each carrying a massive metal container. They descended into a forest clearing not far from where he stood, and carefully placed the container on the ground before vanishing into the clouds again. Curiosity and caution warred within him. The area wasn't far, and something about this felt wrong, too deliberate. So he decided to go to see for himself what new madness the elves had conjured. As he sprinted through the forest, he began to piece together a theory. Judging by the size of the container, It was likely another twisted game, a fresh batch of monsters thrown into the wild, perhaps survivors from past matches. Whatever was inside, whichever side made the first move would claim the advantage. But as he reached the clearing, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. The container opened, and instead of monsters, children stepped out, dozens of them, frightened, confused, and far too young to belong in a place like this. Different races, different backgrounds, but all captives. Among them was a white-haired elf girl, her small frame barely able to stand. Needin stood frozen, so this was the next match. The elves had truly lost their minds. Meanwhile, the elves were busy mocking Nidin, especially after he froze up for a second when he saw the children. Back in the arena, the entire scene was being broadcast live to the audience. Some elves started reconsidering who to bet on this time. A few grumbled about how they'd lost their cars, and even property the last time they bet against Nidin, whom they now called the Gladiator. So this time around, they all agreed. They were betting on him. High above, the master of the arena watched the chaos unfold with a wicked grin. He scoffed at the elves placing their faith in Nidin, calling them fools. Then, turning to the female guards, he asked if they had properly administered the drug to Nidin. The guards confirmed they had, and even added that the effects had already started to kick in. But one guard, still monitoring Nidin through the screen, wasn't convinced. Nidin looked too stable, too composed. She suspected he might be hiding a trump card. Then came a curious question. One of the guards asked whether the master really intended to release Nidin if he won, as promised. The arena lord paused for a moment, then casually dismissed the idea. Why would he do something like that? He admitted that he simply believed Nidin would put on a good show for them. Still, something felt off. Just last night, Nidin had been trying to rip him apart in a blind rage, and now he was suddenly calm and cooperative. The master didn't buy it. He suspected there was some scheme at play, maybe even outside interference. Either way, he had already decided it would be a waste, but Nidin needed to be eliminated. That's why he had the guards drug him in the first place. And with that, the master declared the start of the arena games. For the opening act, he released a few monsters into the field. Just the appetizers. Back with the children, most of them were still confused, trying to make sense of where they'd been dropped. All around them stretched a dense forest, unfamiliar and silent. But that silence didn't last long. Nidin suddenly heard the sound of monsters approaching. Without hesitation, he took off running toward the children. When the children saw someone coming, their faces lit up with hope. They raised their hands and called out to him for help, but Nidin shouted desperately, warning them to run back to the container. Unfortunately, it was already too late. The monsters had arrived. Towering beasts, massive and troll-like, emerged from the trees. The children, especially the one with the horn, turned around and froze in fear as more of the creatures closed in on them. Just as one of the monsters lunged toward the children, a figure appeared out of nowhere. With expert precision, he hurled a dagger straight into the monster's head, killing it instantly. The mysterious warrior stepped into the light, a lizard man. He scowled at the beasts and spat his words with contempt, saying that anyone who would harm children was beneath shame. Calling the elves worthless fools with no honor, he vowed to deal with them all. The remaining monsters charged, but the lizard man calmly retrieved his dagger and stood firm. With fierce eyes, he dared the monsters to come at him. The battle erupted. One of the monsters lunged from above, and although the lizard man dodged, he took a graze to the eye. But in the next breath, he retaliated, slicing the monster clean in half. Its blood rained down on him as he stood unwavering, sword raised, daring the rest to try their luck. The remaining monsters hesitated, frozen in fear. The lizard man now stood like a lone wall between them and the children. Then finally, Nidin arrived. He thanked the lizard man, scooped up the children, and told them to hold on tight. The white-haired elf emerged from the container, urgently telling Nidin to get the kids back inside. Nidin dashed to the container and set the children down, instructing them to get in quickly and lock the door. But the small elf explained the lock was broken. With no other choice, Nidin stood in front of the container, shielding the children with his body. As the next monster came charging at him, Nidin didn't flinch. He blocked the attack effortlessly, his fist winding back. With a brutal punch, he smashed the monster square in the face. Before it could even collapse, he struck it again, crushing its skull. For good measure, and perhaps a bit of release, he lifted the creature's body and smashed it again with another punch, before launching it away with a powerful kick. The brutal display sent a clear message. The remaining monsters, wide-eyed and trembling, began to flee. Seeing that Nidin had taken care of the monsters, the white-haired elf finally stepped out of the container, letting out a long sigh of relief. That had been a close call. Nidin immediately asked if any of the children were hurt. The elf reassured him that, aside from a child named Saterospan, whose legs had given out, and a girl named Betty who had been overwhelmed with fear, the rest were unharmed. Still, Nidin couldn't hide his disgust. Inwardly, he was furious. The elves had sunk so low that they were using their own children as tools for entertainment. It was beyond cruel. Just then, the lizard warrior from earlier emerged. He looked around and nodded, then said he hadn't expected to run into a surface dweller like Needon in a place like this. Needon quickly asked if his eye, the one grazed during the fight, was alright. The warrior simply waved it off, assuring him that it would regenerate in a day or two. Then he formally introduced himself as Akiva Kukchulda. The white-haired elf gave her name as Nili, while Needon introduced himself as Needon Meyer, an outer wing of the Lion Wing Knights. Needon expressed his gratitude, saying it was thanks to Akiva that the children were still alive. The two warriors shook hands. Akiva said he was relieved to see the children safe, but added that something felt off. He was concerned that the monsters had fled so suddenly, without a fight. Needon agreed. It could only mean one thing: the real opponent had arrived. He explained that the true threat of the arena was supposed to be a chimera. At the mention of that, Nili's curiosity was immediately piqued. Needon described it as a massive, crocodile-like beast with giant blade-like limbs growing from its legs. Akiva frowned and wondered aloud if it was the kind with tiger stripes, but before he could finish his thought, his body moved on instinct. With lightning speed, Akiva delivered a powerful kick to Nili, sending her flying back into the container. Needon spun around, furious, demanding to know what Akiva was doing, only to see blood splattering through the air. Akiva's body was suddenly hurled into the sky, torn and mangled. Needon froze. His thoughts spiraled as the scene played out. Once again, someone had gotten hurt, badly, trying to shield him. Just like Aspen, he stood there, helpless, his mind drowning in guilt and anger. Why did this keep happening? Why was it always the people around him who got hurt? His resentment toward the elves boiled to the surface, cursing them, asking where it all went wrong. Meanwhile, Nili was shouting, grabbing him by the shoulders, begging him to snap out of it, and slowly he did. When Needon came to, he looked around at the carnage. The chimera's surprise attack had been devastating. Akiva had lost both of his legs. Needon remained frozen in place while Nili rushed to Akiva's side without hesitation. Bleeding heavily, Akiva looked up and apologized. But Needon, holding his shattered body together, told him not to say such things. He added bitterly that he could still feel that bastard chimera chewing on the legs it had taken from him. Akiva, still clinging to consciousness, explained that based on his calculations, the chimera had retreated 45 degrees toward the direction where the ghouls had fled earlier. But then, a sudden chill ran through his body. He started shivering, yelling that he was feeling incredibly cold. Nodin rushed to his side, asking what was happening, only to realize it was Nili. With calm precision, Nili was using her magic. She had initiated hemostasis and cold preservation on Akiva's severed legs, trying to keep the tissue viable. Nodin was stunned. He never imagined elves had this kind of advanced magic. Before he could ask Nili more about it, Akiva cut in. Eyes wide with alarm, the chimera was coming back. Without hesitation, Nodin grabbed both Nili and Akiva and leapt out of the way. The chimera was invisible now, making its movements nearly impossible to track. When they landed, Nodin quickly checked on the others. Nili said she was fine, and Akiva, grinning despite the blood loss, joked that there wasn't much left of his body to worry about. The destruction left behind by the chimera's charge was massive. It was now clear just how terrifying this monster really was. Getting back on his feet, Nodin muttered that there was no time to rest. That thing would be back. Weaponless, Nodin improvised, taking Akiva's short sword and extending it with a wooden stick to create a makeshift longsword. He asked Akiva if he could borrow it. Akiva simply chuckled and said he didn't need it anymore. He couldn't exactly swing it without legs. Nili, seeing this, raised an eyebrow and asked if Nodin seriously planned to fight that massive monster with such a tiny weapon. She offered to help, saying she could slow the chimera down by freezing the ground. Her plan was simple. Once it lost mobility, they could hit it with everything they had. But Nodin shook his head. That plan wouldn't work. Annoyed, Nili protested. Was Nodin just rejecting her idea for the sake of it? Was it because she looked like a child? She snapped that despite her appearance, she was an elf and likely 10 times older than him. But Nodin calmly cut her off. That wasn't it at all. He explained that he needed her magic, and because of that, they had to adjust the plan, not scrap it. At that moment, the chimera began moving again. Using Akiva's natural lizardman abilities, they decided to rely on him as a radar. Akiva focused his aura and spread it outward, scanning the area. The technique worked perfectly. He pinpointed the chimera's location, 70 meters ahead, closing in fast. Nodin turned to Nili and told her to get ready. She nodded, activating her magic. Although she didn't fully understand Nodin's strategy, she trusted him and was ready to follow his lead. Nodin's eyes glowed with determination. Inwardly, he revealed his plan. He would use the chimera's overwhelming speed and mobility against it. With the frozen ground as his trap, he was going to knock that beast out hard, and that's where this part of the story ends.
Thanks for watching. Those are all the currently available chapters of this series. We'll continue the moment more are released. If you made it to the end of the video, comment stupid elves down below so I know you're one of the real ones. Thanks again for watching and see you next time.